Welcome to Justice in Two Languages.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Justice in Two Languages with Attorney David Elias Idinopulos, founder of Elias Law in Albuquerque, New Mexico. David is a bilingual personal injury attorney who represents New Mexicans after serious crashes and understands how different things can look when an accident happens at highway speeds, especially on roads as busy and unpredictable as I-25 and I-40. I'm Sean O'Connor, and today we're talking about highway wrecks in New Mexico, and David's going to explain why they happen, why they're often more severe, and what makes these cases different from a typical crash in town. David, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm good, Sean. How are you doing?
I'm great. And as you know, I'm not local to New Mexico, but talking every state I think has their notorious corridors. So crashes on I-25 and I-40, they look very different from collisions on the neighborhood streets. What tends to make highway wrecks more serious from the start? I'm going to guess speed for one.
Yeah, speed is the obvious one. There's a big difference between an accident that happens at 30 miles an hour and an accident that happens at 65, 70, 75, and 80 miles an hour. And of course, out here in the West, people drive like demons because there's so much open space. And so what happens a lot of time is that you're cruising along at 80, 85 miles an hour and you're doing that for a long stretch. And you sort of get used to that speed, and then as a motorist, you may encounter a hazard up ahead, and you're so accustomed to driving at that speed, you don't necessarily notice or react quickly because it's not like you're bumper to bumper traffic where you're constantly concentrating on the road in front of you. So accidents, particularly out west, tend to be massive accidents, and lots of force, lots of collision factors, high speeds, lots of twisted steel, lots of blood. Every accident is a serious accident, particularly obviously if you're the victim. But out here, man, when semis are going 70, 75, 80 miles an hour, long stretches, those are big collisions.
Yeah, and obviously semis have accidents, and essentially they've got professional drivers. I'm thinking about, like you said, the tourist who's, wow, look at this, I can do 80. There's not a car in sight. You don't really have any perception. You're not used to doing 80.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you come up on some car that just kind of pulled in off an exit, and it's not easy to judge, I'm guessing,
Exactly.
if you're not a pro.
Right.
Obviously, like a lot of states, New Mexico highways have a mix of commuters, the tourists, long distance travelers, the truckers, all of it, right? So how does that blend of people and driving styles and skills show up in the cases you see?
I think particularly because, again, we are a sparsely populated state. So, for example, between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, it takes about 55 minutes to get to Santa Fe. But there's really not a lot between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, which means that there's not a lot of bumper to bumper driving, and people just generally go a lot faster out here in the West. I mean, I've been an attorney in Michigan and Indiana, and how people drive out here is very, very different. And I think people, as I sort of alluded to earlier, people get very accustomed to just cruising at an incredibly high speed, and then all of a sudden there's a road hazard, something that they encounter, and they're, it's almost like they're sort of lulled to sleep. We just settled a very big case on behalf of, unfortunately it was a death case, but it was a semi that is cruising along at 75 miles an hour, and our vehicle, the vehicle my client was in, had run out of gas, had stalled in the highway, and the semi driver did not do anything to avoid the accident. Hit this poor car, and caused a real tragedy, obviously.
Wow, yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about, okay, we're talking 70, 80 mile an hour crash. There's going to be a chain reaction, right? Unless, well, even if, but whether you're hitting a guardrail, but certainly if you're hitting another vehicle, like what challenges are involved with sorting out, reconstructing what actually happened? Like you just said, the truck driver didn't even react prior to the accident.
Right.
So how do you go about knowing that, short of him or her telling you that?
The good thing now is that with modern technology, with medium to large size companies, a lot of these semis carry an incredible amount of data within
Mm.
their cab. So they are recording speed every 10 seconds. They're recording braking habits every 10 seconds. They're recording what the semi driver, him or herself in the cab, is doing at any particular time. But of course, you only get that information if you send a letter of preservation and tell the semi company very early on, and I'm talking within hours or certainly days of the event, hey, we expect you to preserve this evidence, and if you don't preserve this evidence, we're going to be making a claim. In addition to all the other claims, we're going to be making a claim against you for spoliation of evidence. So there's a great deal of evidence that the semi itself will have available, but you have to immediately take steps to preserve that evidence. And if you preserve that evidence, then you're going to find out all kinds of things about, how often the semi driver was looking at the road and how often he was looking at his phone, how fast he was going and for how long he was going, how many times he had been braking in the last hour, all kinds of things. And in the case that I just mentioned, initially it looked like our client was the one who was at fault, but once we were able to obtain that onboard data from the semi, it revealed an entirely different picture, and it was really what made the case for us.
Oh, wow. I mean, it sounds like when we all heard of in the news, like the black box on airplanes, right? So
Exactly.
it sounds like
Exactly.
these trucks are wired up the same way, more or less.
Yeah. Yeah. They're very
Um,
sophisticated, and semi companies have them because it's an attempt in part to hold their drivers accountable. I mean,
mhm.
the truth is that semi companies, they don't want to cause injuries, but at the same time they want to make money. And so if they can hold down the injuries, if they can hold drivers accountable while keeping their drivers on the road, it's good for them. But when an accident does happen and that data is available, it sometimes bites the semi company in the butt, or alternatively, it may show that their driver was doing nothing wrong, and it might have been our client's fault or the fault of the person who was ultimately hit. But
Yeah.
that's the modern trend. There nothing that happens on the road now with modern vehicles is can be completely hidden. There's all kinds of data that most people don't know about.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, this is just a glittering generality from my point of view, but I think, some of the big rig drivers suffer a reputation problem. And
Sure.
like you said, some of that data is an opportunity to say, no, our driver was well rested, attentive, doing the right things. The truck was maintained and they're not at fault. I
Exactly.
think, and especially when you get into jury situations and that sort of thing. I know you deal with all sorts of, vehicle crashes, commercial to passenger, whatever it might be. In your experience, what stands out about crashes involving the big rigs compared to regular passenger vehicles, aside from, being wired up for all that data?
There are a bunch of things that stand out, and this is no particular order, but when you get involved in a crash with a semi, I'll contrast that with just a regular old automobile, right? Two
Yeah.
cars collide. Now
Car on
all of a
car.
sudden
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You're negotiating with Allstate. Allstate says we accept responsibility. We'll pay the property
Yeah.
damage claim. We'll pay you bodily injury. Almost always in a semi case, when you are involved in an accident with a semi, you have to file suit. I have been astounded at the number of cases that I have with insurance companies that insure semis where liability is abundantly obvious. We send them a letter. Are you going to accept responsibility? The answer is no. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the first is that a lot of these semis, as you might imagine, that are going back and forth from one end of the country to the other are out-of-state corporations. And so the insurance companies for these semis understand that because it's an out-of-state corporation, you have a New Mexico victim because, and this is very technical, but when you have citizens from two different states suing each other, that case goes to federal court. And federal court is incredibly conservative. As a plaintiff's attorney, we think that the deck is stacked against us in federal court because federal judges don't like to preside over these cases. And a federal judge can disagree with me if they want, but the truth of the matter is federal court is where plaintiffs' cases go to die. And semi-companies and insurance companies know that. So that's one of the big differences. The other big difference, obviously, is, with semi-accidents, you have horrendous injuries and you have big insurance policies. And so what might look to you like a case that should settle almost immediately out of the gate, and we attorneys get a lot of those cases in the context of car accidents, but with a semi-accident, because the injuries are so horrendous and the insurance policies are so large, the minute an accident like that happens, it's no longer a tragedy to the semi-company. This is a business decision, and semi-companies are going to do whatever they can possibly do to hold down their exposure. And it's really not even necessarily the semi-companies, it's the insurance companies that they have retained to represent their interests. The other thing that's different about it is you get into an accident with a passenger vehicle and you're negotiating, as I said, Allstate, State Farm, whoever that may be. With semi-companies, they have layers of coverages. And so the first layer of coverage may be $1 million or $5 million, whatever it is. But the next layer of coverage may be a different insurance company entirely. And then on top of that, you have another layer of coverage from a different insurance company, which is another reason why so many of these cases wind up in litigation. So you as the average person may think, I got hit by a semi, I got a broken leg, I had to have surgery. The semi company is going to treat me fair because obviously they caused the accident. But there are all kinds of reasons why it is that the semi company, when you contact them, may say, well, we'll offer you a little bit of money to go away, but we're not going to pay this claim without a fight. And the reason for that is, as I've laid out, federal court jurisdiction, multiple layers of insurance. It's a very complex situation.
Yeah, that's tough, especially if you're, if you're the victim with the injuries, and a lot of times I mean, $1 million to go away might seem tempting, but
they will never offer you $1 million to go away. They'll offer you 25,000 to go away.
Yeah,
and
depending on
that might be a good deal.
That's real money, but also like so many of these injuries, I know in talking to other attorneys and doctors in these kinds of scenarios, injuries, they're not apparent. You don't know what kind of long-term, situation you're dealing with. So, that's a whole nother conversation, I think. But
sure.
I want to ask about, we're talking about the open, the wide open expanses in the West. Some of the most serious injuries happen out in the rural stretches between the cities, like you described. How does like that distance, limited cell phone service, limited, the next gas station 70 miles away, emergency response times are longer. How does that affect? How do all those things affect the early stages of a case?
Very often when we have an accident that is in an extremely rural part of the state, one of the first bills that we obtain, one of the first bills that we see on behalf of our clients, is a helicopter ride. Because when you are out between in New Mexico, it would be between Klein's Corners, say, and Roswell, New Mexico. That is about 2 hours and 45 minutes of driving at 75 miles an hour with barely a stop in between. Very few ambulances, obviously, in the area. Very few hospitals in the area. So in order to rescue somebody who has been in a major accident, very often it is an air flight ambulance that rescues them and takes them to a hospital. And they may take them to a hospital here in New Mexico, but they also may take them to a hospital in Texas. So a lot of times when we have to meet with a client who's been involved in a New Mexico accident, we are going to be driving to Lubbock. We're going to be driving to Midland, Odessa, places like that to meet a client who was involved in an accident in New Mexico.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. The other aspect always, right, is let's say sort of the emotional toll, right? Highway crashes. I mean, you get a little fender bender, you kind of get shaken up. How do you help clients work through the stress that comes with, kind of reliving high-speed collision? It's almost like a PTSD thing, I imagine.
Right. It is exactly a PTSD thing. I've got clients who have had loved ones maimed, injured, killed years ago who are still living with this pain. I've had clients come to my office to pick up very, very large settlement checks And, they're happy to get that check, of course, but, they very often leave in tears. And sometimes I will, sort of watch them from the window as they leave the office, holding on to their husband, holding on their wives. And, there's no amount of money that compensates them for the loss of their son, their daughter, their husband, their wife. It's an emotional moment, even when we present them with money for the loss of their loved one. The first rule of thumb is to be straight with them. And I think that attorneys get a lot of different reputations. And I know in my business, there are plenty of attorneys who are willing to tell a client anything that they think that client wants to hear in order that they get a case. And I don't do that. I am straight with clients. If a client walks into my office and tells and gives me the scenario, and I can see that it's going to be a tough case, I tell them it's going to be a tough case. You may have to compromise. We'll see what the facts show. But I try to level with clients as best I can. The other thing that I tell clients, particularly when we're dealing with a real tragedy, when we're dealing with life-altering injuries, or when we're dealing with a death case, what I tell them is, look, I make my living off of your misfortune, and there's never a time that I'm not aware of that. And that seems to reassure clients when I tell them I understand that this is the worst imaginable tragedy that you are going through. And yeah, I'm going to charge a fee for my services, but I'm a parent too. I'm a husband. I have my own parents. And when you lose somebody that close, it's a tragedy. I know you're going through a tragedy. If you have questions, if you want to talk, I'll be here for you. There's no magic recipe for how you handle a client. You've got to just be straight with them.
People listening out there, maybe they spend a lot of time on I-25, I-40, some of these major roadways. What would you tell them in terms of, how to stay aware of different, because these roads are different from their everyday roads,
Sure.
I don't know if it's advice or, hey, in your experience, bing, bang, boom, what would be your few words of wisdom here?
4 words: stay off your phone. That's it. I had a case where a semi driver caused a massive collision, and the evidence revealed that driver was on his phone. Stay off your phone more than anything else. It's simple that everybody knows this stuff, and we all slip from time to time. We're driving, we get a text, or we're playing music on our phone. We don't like the song. We avert our eyes, and when you avert your eyes, that is when it happens. That's it.
On that note, we'll say goodbye for this episode, but always good to talk to you.
You as well, Sean. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Justice in 2 Languages. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to learn more about Attorney David Elias Idinopulos and his team at Elias Law, David, where do people find you?
Abogado, in other words, the Spanish word for lawyer, abogadoelias.com, or you can give us a call at 505-888-8888. Muchos ochos.
Awesome. You'll find resources in English and Spanish on the site to help you understand your rights and feel supported after a serious crash. Thanks again for listening, and as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, or share this episode with someone who you think could benefit from it. I'm Sean O'Connor. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.